This week, Indian announced an updated 2022 version of their Chief models in order to celebrate 100 years of this iconic line of bikes. It's had a massive restyling which I think has transformed it into a much more desirable bike, but it's also gained a few neat new features, so in today's video we'll go over every little detail of these awesome looking new cruisers. But before we get started, if you're new here and you want to see all of the latest motorcycle news right here on YouTube, then please do remember to hit subscribe. Let's start with the Thunderstroke 116 engine that sits at the heart of the new Indian Chiefs. It was first announced at the back end of 2019 for their larger touring bikes like the Roadmaster, Chieftain and Springfield, and there's nothing particularly fancy about it. It's just a massive, torquey, pushrod-driven air-cooled V-twin that suits the old-school character of many of their bikes very nicely. For 2021 in these Chief models, it'll produce a peak torque of 162 Nm. Now that is slightly down on the big Tourers, so perhaps emissions regulations have required them to detune it a little. But it's still absolutely loads of torque and produced right down at 3,200 RPM. There's no peak power figure quoted, but I reckon it'd be safe to assume it's somewhere around the 85 or 90 mark, judging from previous specs. That doesn't sound like a great deal from a 1,890cc engine, but it's pretty much entirely built around producing that low-end torquey shove. The only modern tech to speak of is the rear cylinder deactivation, which shuts off the cylinder under the seat at a standstill to keep the rider cool in traffic. The front cylinder keeps the engine ticking over so that both can fire immediately as soon as the throttle is applied. Now, Ducati recently announced it as a whizzy new feature on the Multistrada V4, but to be fair to Indian, they've been doing it for ages. The classic character of the engine is continued through the chassis with a traditional steel tube frame that is a thing of beauty in its own right. Rich Christoph, lead designer at Indian, shared some of his designs and sketches on Instagram, and it really shows off the swooping lines and details on this new frame. The twin shocks are integrated neatly into the flow of the rear end to give it that old-school rigid frame look. Suspension is relatively unfussy with some chunky 46mm right-weight up forks and a couple of rear shocks with preload adjusters, but while there's 132mm of travel on the fork, which seems reasonable, there's just 75mm at the rear. That might be alright riding solo on the Chief or Chief Bobber, but it does have me wondering if the Super Chief will be prone to bottoming out when loaded up with luggage and a passenger. Braking is taken care of by a single 300mm disc at the front with an own branded 4-pot caliper, and there's a 2-pot also on a 300mm disc at the rear. Tyres are from Pirelli in the form of their cruiser-specific Night Dragons. In fact, they actually claim that they're optimized for torquey V-twins on the Pirelli website. In terms of the key dimensions, both the Chief and Bobber have a super low seat height of 662mm, which should be accessible to all but very few riders, and the Super Chief is only 3mm higher at 665. The Chief is the lightest of the bunch at 304 kilograms with a full tank of fuel, and that goes up to 315 with the Bobber, presumably owing to the fat tyres, spoke wheels, fork guard and headlight nacelle. But of course, the Super Chief is the biggest of the bunch at 335 kilograms. All three bikes come with a 15.1-litre fuel tank, which isn't Harley Sportster or Triumph Bobber tiny, but it isn't huge either. Although the Super Chief has a bit of a touring-friendly look about it, if you're after proper big miles, then something like the Chieftain, Springfield Roadmaster or Challenger might be a better bet, as all of them can carry over 20 litres. In terms of tech, the Chief is a bit of a mixed bag. There are certainly some nice features like keyless ignition, full LED lighting, a USB port for your phone, riding modes, cruise control, and ABS, but there's still no traction control, which is somewhat surprising in 2021. Now, I'm sure a lot of you'll say that it doesn't need it, and Indian must think so too, because they do have the tech available to them. Take the Challenger, for example, which has lean-sensitive rider aids, including traction control, powered by a 6-axis Bosch IMU. But they've clearly designed the look and ride of this bike to lean much more towards the heritage vibe. But perhaps the biggest talking point from a tech perspective is the new dash, which is a 10cm round version of their ride command system that we've seen on their other bikes. So while it still fits the classic aesthetic of the Chief, and you can set the display to a traditional speeder and revs layout, underneath it all there's a fully functioning infotainment system. So there's bike and ride information as well as turn-by-turn nav, and if you've paired it with a headset and a phone, You can control music, calls, and text messages. Now you can administer all of this stuff either from the switchgear or as a touchscreen, which not many other manufacturers currently offer. I guess they wouldn't advise using it on the move, but at a standstill, it might make the menus a little easier to navigate. On to the styling though, and for me, Indian have done an incredible job with all of these bikes. The Chief Dark Horse looks particularly well formed to my eye, but all of them seem to really nail that classic cruiser silhouette and stance. You might say it's a shame to lose those signature full-length flicked mudguards or fenders as you might call them, as you can see that they date right back to the inception of the Chief in 1921, but I think realistically, it's in favour of a design that far more people will find appealing. It's like they took the Scout Bobber, which for me has long been their best looking bike, and just beefed it up a bit and added some flowing lines. Now in the US, it looks as though there'll be 6 models. There's a 111 cubic inch standard Chief and Chief Bobber sitting below the Dark Horses, and a Super Chief 111 below the Super Chief Limited. But in Europe, we'll just get the 3 116 models, so the Chief Dark Horse, Chief Bobber Dark Horse, and the Super Chief Limited. The Chief Dark Horse is the most stripped down of the bunch, with drag handlebars, cast wheels with a 19-inch front, mid-mount foot controls, a slim headlight bucket, and a solo bobber seat. Color choices are threefold, with black smoke, alumina jade smoke, and stealth grey. Pricing starts at £15,795. The Chief Bobber Dark Horse comes with mini ape hanger bars and foot forward controls, which Indians say provides a more upright and commanding riding position. The wheels are swapped out for more Bobber-esque 16 inches with spokes and gets fatter rubber to match. There are also some fork and shock covers and a large headlight bucket wrapped in a nacelle to beef the front end up. For colours, there's also black smoke, as well as titanium smoke and sagebrush smoke. Prices start at £17,695 for this one. And last up, the Big Daddy, the Super Chief Limited, which favours all-day comfort with a quick-release windscreen, black leather saddlebags, a touring seat with a passenger pad, floorboards, and traditional cruiser-style bars. It gets the same 16-inch wheels as the Bobber, as well as the fork covers and nacelle, but the engine and exhaust finish on this one is chrome, as opposed to the black of the 2 Dark Horses. Colour choices are black metallic, blue slate metallic, and maroon metallic, and you'll be looking at £19,995 starting price. So the Super Chief Limited sort of bridges the gap between the cruisers and the bigger tourers, but for me the one that I'd love to ride the most is the Chief Dark Horse. The 19-inch front and shorter mudguards have really modernised the look of this bike, but at the same time it still manages to retain that classic stance and simple riding experience, and all for the most affordable starting price. But as always, I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. Which would be your pick, and what do you reckon to that new dash? I think they've made a good job of it. They've got to keep pace with the tech offered by other manufacturers, but a big TFT slab would have ruined the cockpit, so this seems like the right compromise. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you next time.